You're listening to Kingdom Thinking, a podcast series designed to start a conversation around the deeper intellectual questions surrounding life, faith, and meaning. Here are a collection of questions, ideas, and stories that I hope will challenge you to think about your own beliefs, and perhaps introduce you to new perspectives, regardless of where you are in your journey. I'm your host, Al Butcher, and I can't wait to share this episode with you. This episode is going to be entirely devoted to considering morality. What is it? Where does it come from? What nature is it? And can it tell us anything about the world and universe around us? So, I want to start this episode by talking about a near universal behavior that is unique to human beings among all animals. Quarreling. You might think of it as arguing or debating as well. Let me give you some examples of what I mean. We might hear statements like, "Why should he get more lollies than I do?" Or, "It's my turn, I was here first." Or perhaps, "How would you like it if someone did that to you?" Or even the classic, "That's just unfair." All kinds of people say these sorts of things all throughout their days, from very young children all the way to the very elderly, from the most uneducated to the most intelligent, brilliant people we may ever meet. Now, what is quite interesting about these kinds of arguments and quite strange about these sorts of statements is that it's clear that we're not just expressing that we don't like the behavior. We invariably do dislike the behavior, but we are also claiming that there is some standard of conduct that we think they've fallen short of. Some way that they ought to behave or share out the lollies or wait their turn that they haven't kept up to. What's perhaps even more interesting is that the other person very rarely replies that the standard is simply rubbish. Even a child confronted by their wrongdoing in this way will try to invent some excuse as to why it is appropriate that they push in line or they have more lollies than their brother or sister. Perhaps they are going to have to leave soon, so they want just one more turn before they have to go. Maybe they worked extra hard at their chores today, so they deserve more lollies than their brother. Or perhaps they only cheated at school because everyone else was doing so, and there was no other way to really keep up with the class. Adults generally do the same. They only stole your seat on the train while you went to the bathroom because their leg was so extremely sore. Or the times they clocked in more hours than they worked was because they did work so extremely hard, and if you knew the customers they had to deal with, and if you knew how mean and cruel their boss was. It certainly seems that humans all seem to at least make use of some kind of law or rule of fair play or good conduct when they're having these quarrels. If they didn't, well, there wouldn't actually be any sense in quarreling. The purpose of quarreling and debating is to show that someone else is in the wrong. So the very fact that we can have these kinds of arguments and that we can be trying to show that we think someone else's conduct is wrong means that we must have some idea of what was right and what was wrong to do in that situation. What is this idea? Where do we actually get this conception? The first thought might be that it is some kind of human idea, something that we only know because our parents taught it to us, or our teachers, our friends, the books we read, or the films we watch. However, there are two kinds of things that we teach. We teach people conventions and we teach people facts. Conventions are like in Australia that we drive on the left-hand side of the road and we go when the traffic light is green. Conventions are things that might have been different. We could drive on the right-hand side of the road if we wanted to instead of the left. In fact, plenty of Americans manage just fine doing so. And the colour to go at a traffic light could just as easily be purple instead of green. However, just because something is taught to us and because we learn it from other humans doesn't mean that it's a convention that humans have invented. It could be a fact. We all learn the multiplication table at school, but 7 times 5 is equal to 35 whether we like it or not, and whether we know it or not. There is one big reason why I believe this law, This standard of moral conduct is more like mathematics than a convention, and it is this. When you think about and compare the moralities of one people to another, like the morals of an America where slavery was rife and modern-day Western democracies, do you not believe that one is better than the other? Even those who most fiercely believe that morality is some human convention cooked up by societies to catch themselves making moral judgments of what other people and other societies believe and have believed. We say things like, "I can't believe they used to keep slaves. How wrong and cruel of them it was to do so." By making this kind of judgment that one set of morals is truer or better than another, we must be measuring them both by a standard. We're in fact saying that one set of morals is better than the other, regardless of what the people who held those morals thought about it. Even further than that, we're saying that the standard we're measuring them by is the right standard, whether anyone likes it or not. In fact, by making that kind of moral judgment, we're saying that right is right, regardless of what anyone thinks about it. We show our true colors about what we believe with the moral judgments we make every day. Now, here you might argue that many societies have had different moralities over the years, and have acted in many different ways due to culture. This is true, but these differences are rarely so great as we imagine. Imagine for a moment what a total reversal of morality would look like. Imagine a culture where soldiers would be applauded for cowardice and scorned for bravery, where the man who cheated everyone he ever loved was praised, and where the lazy worker was congratulated while the hard worker was ignored. Cultures have differed as to whether you should only be unselfish to your family, or to your friends, or to everyone, but they all agree that unselfishness is an admirable quality. They have differed as to whether you ought to have one wife or four, but they have still generally agreed that you shouldn't just have any woman you like. But then, couldn't morality just be preference? Certainly we judge other moral systems, but aren't we just judging them by what is inconvenient or painful to us? Don't we judge an America which kept slaves simply because we ourselves would not like to be made a slave? Well, imagine a scenario where a friend of yours trips you by accident, and you take a fall. You might have hurt your arm, be quite inconvenienced, and drop the things that you're carrying, but you would in no way think that your friend had done anything wrong. Your moral sensibilities have not been awakened yet. Now imagine that someone else obviously tries to trip you over, but fails. Now you believe that this person has done something that they ought not to have done. Even though you weren't inconvenienced, even though no harm was done to you, your moral sensibilities are still awakened. Your moral sense is then clearly over and above what inconveniences you or what harms you, because it's been awakened in a situation where you haven't suffered any harm at all. Now then, you might ask, isn't morality just the herd instinct, or the instinct for self-preservation? Haven't our moral systems just evolved from those instincts as a convenient way to encourage behaviors that are good for us in the long run? This might be true, except we don't find any instinct within us that our moral senses always agree with. When we look on a drowning man, our herd instinct tells us to help him, and our moral compass agrees. However, when someone is being mocked by a group of others, our herd instinct would tell us to join the mocking, but our moral compass would firmly disagree. In fact, there is no instinct or impulse, physical, sexual, or personal, that our moral sense will always agree with, and so, again, it must be something else. In fact, this moral law is different from any other natural law we observe. The law of gravity tells us that a dropped stone will fall to the ground, and the law of magnetism tells us that the north and south poles of two magnets will attract one another. These laws describe what is, or what will happen in a certain situation, or what does happen, while the moral law talks about what we should do, what we ought to do, even when the reality of what we actually do might be quite different. Thus, we can't have gotten this idea or discovered this law from nature, or simply from observing how things are, because the way things are tells us nothing of how they ought to be. This law cannot, therefore, simply exist or hold up its own weight. This moral law must be grounded in something, otherwise we would have no reason to follow it, nor any way of having discovered it. We've already shown that as humans we can't have invented it, and now we can see that it can't just exist in nature. Thus, it has to be grounded in something else. So, to recap, we have some law that is bigger than just a human convention, bigger than simple preference, and more complex and varied than any of our instincts, and that we neither made nor seem quite able to shake off, no matter how much we might try to, and it must be grounded in something else. And now we come to one of the fundamental problems of humanity. So far, I haven't mentioned anything about this something else, so we know nothing about it except what we can figure out by examining the moral law itself. Unfortunately, there is little comfort to be found in the moral law. It's as hard as nails and as straight as an arrow. It tells you to do the right thing, regardless of how painful, dangerous, or difficult it might be to do it. It is good in the truest, completest, and most terrifying sense of the word. Worse still, if this something is impersonal, then there would be no sense in asking it to let us off when we make mistakes. Only a personal being can forgive. If the something is impersonal, we might as well ask mathematics to let us off when we get our calculations wrong. We will be bound to get the wrong answer, regardless of how much we plead. And now we see that as a people and as societies, we are undeniably making ourselves into enemies of that goodness, day in and day out. Look at the world around us and what we've done to it. Look at the wars which tear apart families, communities, and countries. Look at those in our cities and our nations who are uncared for, ignored, and pushed to the fringes. Look even within ourselves at how many times, when we're honest with ourselves, we have been cruel, unfair, or selfish, even when we know we ought to have done otherwise. We are truly in deep, deep trouble here. As if this great power is truly good, it must hate an awful lot of what we do. And if not, then we have even more cause for concern. We might protest that, after all, things aren't that bad, surely. Certainly none of us have been perfect, but none of us are truly evil, are we? It seems a bit doom and gloom to describe it in those terms. But again, think of a scientist or a mathematician performing a long and complicated calculation. If he gets so much as a single step wrong, then his entire answer becomes worthless and unreliable. It doesn't matter if he performed 500 of the 501 steps correctly. The single misstep is enough for him to throw that answer aside and never look at it again. In the same way, even a single moral misstep must be a disgusting affront to this perfectly good being. It's only from this platform that it is possible to fully understand the Christian message. Morality is, therefore, possibly the greatest hint that we have of the existence of the supernatural. Some inside feeling of how we ought to behave that transcends the way we do. In fact, it's exactly the type of hint we would expect to find if a God did exist. It would be foolish looking for an architect as a wall or window in the house he designed, just as it would be foolish to look for William Shakespeare as a character in one of his plays. Similarly, God would not be waiting somewhere for us in nature just to be discovered like a rock or waterfall, but rather his creative influences, wills, and purposes must be interpreted between the pen strokes of creation. And look, the one aspect of creation we can truly understand, the one place where we can look in between the pen strokes, the human heart, we find a curious yearning and inclination to behave in a way that is right and good. Surely that, by itself, ought to be enough to arouse our curiosity. Thank you for listening to this episode of Kingdom Thinking. I release new episodes every week, so jump on the Kingdom Thinking Facebook page for notifications about episodes as they come out, as well as information about the episodes like transcripts. Until next time, have a great week and God bless.